Hi, welcome back to Statistics 1. In today's lecture, we'll be talking about descriptive statistics. As I said in the first lecture, most introductory statistics textbooks, whether they're in psychology or economics or sociology or political science, split the field of statistics into descriptives and inferential statistics. That's a common technique because descriptive statistics, one, are a lot easier, and two, you need to use a lot of the concepts that you learn in descriptive statistics to do inferential statistics. So today, in just one lecture, I'll provide you with an overview of the essentials of descriptive statistics, and then we'll be ready to move on to the more difficult task of inferential statistics. So to give you a layout of today's lecture, it's organized into three segments. In the first segment, we're going to take a broad view, sort of look at all the data in a very broad range. So this is common when we collect data in research. Once an experiment is done, we want to look at all of our data, all of our variables, all of our cases of all of our variables, just so we know what we have. In the second segment, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to calculate summary statistics. So when I gather my research together and I want to go to a conference to present my work, or I want to write it up for publication, I need just a few talking points. And that's when I'll move from the broad view of histograms and distributions to this more focused view of summary statistics. And in the third segment, I'll focus on some key tools that you'll need as we move forward to inferential statistics. So in this first segment, we're going to talk about histograms and sample distributions. So what do I mean by that? That's one of the goals of this segment, is to understand what I mean when I say sample distribution. The sample distribution will be displayed in a histogram, and you'll see that momentarily. You'll see the normal distribution, or bell curve, repeatedly throughout this course. But that doesn't mean that all variables are distributed normally. There are lots of variables in nature and in psychology that aren't normally distributed. So we need to know how to spot non-normal distributions. And for that, I'll talk about the idea of skew and kurtosis. So first, you might think, why are we starting with histograms? Just in an average day, if you are browsing the internet or reading a newspaper or watching television, you're exposed to lots of fancy graphics that summarize data, much fancier than histograms. But histograms are the place to start because they show the entire sample distribution for one variable. And why do we want to do that? Well, we want to overcome, and I'd like for you to work on this as you go through the course, is to overcome the tendency, and it's a natural tendency, to rely upon summary or aggregate information. So as an analogy, we often stereotype people based on their group membership. But we all know we shouldn't do that if we really want to get to know a person, right? We want to look at all the people within a group to get to know each individual person. So the stereotype is sometimes helpful because it's an aggregate. It gives us some basis for prediction about people. But we don't want to rely upon that initially. So at first, we'll take this broad view and look at everybody in the distribution. So this first example I'm going to start with is just very simple normal distribution measuring a sample of 100 people's body temperature. Okay? What I'm plotting is a histogram. So a histogram will have the actual score. So in this case, it's body temperature in Fahrenheit. So already I'm revealing my American egocentrism there, sorry. So the average is about 100 Fahrenheit. That's about, what, 20 Celsius, I think? But I'm plotting the body temperatures on the x-axis and then just frequency on the y-axis. So how many people in the sample had the body temperature that's in a particular interval. So we're just looking at frequency on the y-axis. And what you see here is just a very normal distribution, has sort of a high peak relative to the standard normal distribution. The other thing you'll notice about it, if you remember sort of from high school biology, and again, forgive me if you're used to thinking of this in Celsius, but most of us think of 98.6 as the average normal body temperature. And if you look at this histogram, we're getting an average of about 100. And the reason for this is this sample distribution was taken by going around to 100 people, healthy people, and using this new infrared wand thermometer. So there are different ways that you can measure body temperature, and the wand tends to overestimate body temperature. And that bias in measurement is important. We're going to come back to that when we talk about measurement issues. Here's a better known histogram that you may be familiar with, the bell curve representing individual differences in intelligence. This was the name of the book published by Herrnstein and Murray that caused a lot of controversy in psychology and in the social sciences in general. But again, it's a histogram. So here's the frequency, and what we're plotting is intelligence scores, and you get a normal distribution. So most people are around average, but some people are exceptionally bright, they're way up here, and some people not so much, they're down here. Okay, so that's the idea of a normal distribution, and they're a very well-known one and very controversial one. So again, the reason we're starting with histograms is they often reveal important information that's missed or glossed over if you just provide summary statistics. And another sort of controversial example that is perfect to demonstrate this point is the notion that there might be sex differences in spatial reasoning in adults. So, and this has been observed in some studies in the intelligence and cognitive psychology literatures. Depends on the type of spatial reasoning task you administer. But sometimes you do see, if you rely on the summary statistics, the mean, say, the mean for the men might be a little higher than the mean for the women. But the variance within each group, the spread within each group, the differences within each gender is far greater than that little gap in the mean differences. And you'll see that in the histograms. So let's look at histograms. Studies that demonstrate this sex difference, they typically, we can call it an independent variable, right, sex, and then the dependent variable score on a spatial reasoning task. But remember back to lecture 1 when we talked about randomized experiments, this is not a true independent variable. So that's why I wrote concerns at the bottom, right? We can't randomly assign people to be male or female, right? So we have to be careful characterizing this as an experiment, but just for ease of demonstration, there's our experimental setup, if you will. And I just simulated data in R. That's real easy to do. I'll show you how to do that in the Intro to R lecture. And I just assumed that we would have about 50 females and 50 males in the sample. And as it turns out, the mean for the males was a little bit higher than the mean for females. And as I said, this has been observed in some studies depending on what type of spatial reasoning task is used. But let's look at the histograms. First, I'm going to show you females in red. And what you see is sort of normal distribution. The peak is a little toward the positive end of the distribution, but it's pretty normal. And it has a pretty high peak if I wanted to smooth it. But one thing to notice in this graph is the frequency. There's 14 women who have a score in the range of like 70 to 80. Actually, if we add in the 8, there's over 20 that are in this range. Let's compare that to the males. So here's the histogram for the males. What you see is, if you look at the y-axis, frequency, see this number here is 8. Let's go back and look at the women. We had 14 was the peak in that histogram. So what we're seeing here in the male distribution is also a normal distribution, but it's sort of, it doesn't have as high of a peak. The other thing to notice, and this will be clear if we put them side by side, is there's a difference up here at the top end of the distribution. And this is actually what's observed in a lot of studies that show this sex difference. But before I get to that, again, notice the massive amount of overlap of these two distributions. So if we look at the overlap from here to here, that's the overlap. So the two distributions have much more in common than separates them. And what really separates them is we have some males at the top end of the distribution where we don't have females, and we have a lot more females and in the middle part of the distribution, sort of average. And again, that is common. What's exciting is that new research, very recent in the last few years, has demonstrated that these types of spatial reasoning skills can be trained through practice in video games, in things like statistics, and even in certain types of sports, like martial arts or wrestling, where you have to sort of plan and execute in three-dimensional space. And what's even more exciting is that those training effects appear to be bigger in women than in men. So I think what we're seeing is just some of these people, some of the women in the middle of the distribution moving out to the end of the distribution through practice. Okay, one more example just to sort of drive home the point that looking at histograms can often show you more than just looking at summary statistics. This example is a little bit older. In the 1960s, when contraception was first made available legally in the United States, the drug manufacturers were concerned that certain drugs were causing an increase in blood pressure. So they wanted to do a study to test whether women who were taking the pill, as it was called, had an increased blood pressure relative to women who weren't taking the pill. Again, the problem here is it was difficult to do a true randomized experiment, especially in the 60s. It was a very controversial topic in the United States, so it wasn't very easy to just take people into a lab and randomly assign them to contraception or not. It probably still wouldn't fly. So they just had to rely on women who were either taking the pill or not taking the pill. So again, this is not a true independent variable. That's, again, why I have concerns down there. And then we can measure blood pressure. And again, just for ease of illustration, I'm going to plot just systolic blood pressure. Again, I just made up data in R, 100 users, 100 non-users. And if we just look at the means, it looks like there's a little bit of an effect of the drug. So 120 is about normal for systolic, and the users are up at about 124, whereas the non-users are right at 120. So it does look like there's a little bump. But let's look at the histograms to see where that bump is coming from. So the users are in yellow, so these are the women who are on the pill. And what you see is an average around 120, a little higher because of this peak right here. But you get sort of a normal distribution. Let's look at the non-users and then put them together. And here you sort of see a different picture than the spatial reasoning example, right? It looks like the whole histogram, the whole distribution of users is just sort of shifted about 4 or 5 points, right? So if I just did a curve over that and then a curve over that, the whole distribution shifted, which, again, this isn't a true independent variable, so we can't really make a causal statement. But the fact that the effect looks like it affected the entire distribution in the same exact way is suggestive that indeed it was causal. And follow-up research actually supported that conclusion. Another thing you can see in these histograms, and if you've taught statistics a long time like I have, or if you do a lot of research and you stare at these things every day, you probably saw it already, is it looks like there's almost 2 distributions in there, right? So I could, in the users, I could sort of see like one there and another one there, right? And histograms will show you that. And indeed, these data were simulated based on a study where they had smokers and non-smokers in each group, because they wanted to see if the drug had interacted with that in any way. So what you're seeing in this second distribution are the smokers. So smokers generally have higher blood pressure than non-smokers. So we would see that by looking at the sample distributions in histograms. We would lose that if we just looked at summary statistics. Okay, so those were all just assuming that we had normal distributions. Let's look at what some non-normal distributions look like. And there are all sorts of possibilities. I'm just going to show you 3. And to do that, we're going to go wine tasting. I enjoy wine tasting. I also like that this picture has wine glasses that have sort of different distributional shapes. So it reminds me of bell curve and non-normal distributions. So it was a good image to take. And this is actually done. There's a science on wine tasting, and they're experts. So there are actual studies like this. So let's assume that we had 30 wine experts rate the overall quality of 4 different red wines. And they rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. Higher scores indicate higher quality. I picked 4 red wines that have really funny names, but they're true red wines. So these are actual red wines. You can go find them at your local wine store. So the 4 that I picked are Whoop Whoop, Red Truck, Hobnob, and Foreplay. They're all fun to say. They're actually all pretty good, too. I'm not a big fan of Red Truck, but Whoop Whoop, Hobnob, Foreplay, they're all good. I'm plotting 4 histograms all on one slide here, so forgive me, it's a little hard to see. We can zoom in. But I'm plotting them all on one slide so that we can compare what these different distributions look like. So what you see for Whoop Whoop is just a rectangular shape for the distribution. So the ratings were all over the place. Some of the wine raters loved it, some of them hated it, some of them thought it was average. They were all over the place. That's a uniform distribution. Red Truck is showing this nice normal distribution. Hobnob is showing a positive skew, and Foreplay is showing a negative skew. And the way to remember this skew idea is the skew is where there are few in the distribution. So for Hobnob, there were just a few raters who really liked it. So that's why it was skewed. It wasn't like Red Truck where it was normal and symmetrical, right? There were just a few that liked it. So that's positively skewed. Foreplay is the opposite. There were just a couple that really didn't like it. So it was negatively skewed. I can show those distributions instead of me awkwardly drawing with the stylus. I promise to get better. you can do this in R is just plot what's called a density plot. It's basically a smoothed histogram. And this slide shows the difference among the four distributions nicely. So it tries to smooth that rectangle, right? But it's still just a rectangle. Then we got the nice normal. We've got a little positive skew and a little negative skew. So that's taking the broad view and looking at sample distributions, the entire distribution via histograms. You could then summarize that information, and we're going to do that basically in four ways. We're going to look at measures of central tendency, we're going to look at measures of variability, then skew and kurtosis, which refers to the peak or like the uniform distribution as the opposite of a peak. And if you're coming from a strong math background, particularly if you know your calculus inside and out, you'll recognize these as the four moments of the mean. So to review this segment on histograms, the important concepts to take away are just one, what do I mean when I say a distribution? I mean a distribution of scores in a sample on some variable. We're going to use that normal distribution a lot. We're going to assume that some of our variables are normally distributed. We'll question that assumption, but we'll assume it. And we'll learn how to spot non-normal distributions by looking at skew and kurtosis.